Hello and welcome to Mid-Coast Morning, CHLY's weekly current affairs show. I'm Joe Pugh. Here's what we're following this week. A number of applications relating to the Fairy Creek logging saga will be heard in Nanaimo this week. I got some third-party legal perspective from Andrew Gage, who works with West Coast Environmental Law. And after speaking with the 4 other local candidates in the election earlier this month, today we'll hear from Stephen Welton, representing the People's Party. Also on the election, our riding and several others across the country are experiencing a shortage of poll workers. Andrea Marantz from Elections Canada explained the situation to me earlier this week. And finally, large quantities of sea cucumbers off the coast of Nanaimo were recently found dead and diseased. I spoke with Kathleen Reed, who first discovered them, and Dr. Isabelle Côté from Simon Fraser University, who has since been investigating why. We begin, however, with some upcoming court matters here in Nanaimo. 4 different civil applications related to logging in Fairy Creek will be heard in a BC Supreme Court in Nanaimo next week. Among them, forestry company Teal Cedar is seeking a year-long extension to the injunction put in place earlier this year. That injunction made it unlawful to impede forestry activities at Fairy Creek, and since then, the RCMP have made hundreds of arrests of protesters. Another of the applications is from the Attorney General on behalf of the RCMP, who are seeking the ability to search the persons, bags, and vehicles of anyone entering the premises covered by the injunction, and to deny access to anyone they find carrying materials that could be used in breach of the injunction, or anyone who denies permission for the search. To get some legal perspective on what it could mean and how it could affect the landscape going forward, I spoke to Andrew Gage from West Coast Environmental Law, a nonprofit group of environmental lawyers. I know that one of the court cases is deciding on whether or not the injunction that has been in place will be extended for another year because it's going to expire at the end of September. So could you tell me a little bit about that case, about what the injunction expiring means, how likely it is that it will be renewed?
So the injunctions are an order by, this type of injunction is an order by the court to keep the rights of parties in a lawsuit the same until a trial, at least in theory. So in order to get this injunction, Teal Jones had to sue some individuals in the Flying Rainforest Squad, essentially, saying that they were interfering with their right to log. And then the judge has said, well, until we get to trial, let's have an injunction to keep this in place. Now, in reality, Teal Jones may well not be intending to go to trial. They really want the injunction. But legally, that's how the courts have always viewed this type of injunction. So it's not intended to be in place permanently. It's intended to be in place until the rights of the parties are settled at a future trial, which means that the judge, I think the original judge issuing the injunction quite properly, had an expiry date attached to it. And it means that Teal Jones has to come back and explain why they haven't been. I don't think the court will necessarily object to the fact it hasn't been moving forward because no one really wants this case to move forward. But they have to come back and explain why it makes sense for this sort of guarantee of their rights to continue, even though there has not yet been a hearing on the ultimate rights of the logging company versus the rights of the protesters, but also, I think importantly, the rights of the public. Because what's become clear with the injunction so far is that, quite aside from the rights of people who are actually blocking logging, the injunction is, as it's being interpreted by the police and Teal Jones, is actually preventing members of the public from accessing old growth areas for recreation, for spiritual reasons, or for whatever, for camping, and the rights of media to be there and cover the story, the rights of the public just to use these roads are all being impacted. And that's a fairly significant issue that I think will probably be before the judge in deciding whether to renew the injunction or not, or whether to change the terms of the injunction. And keep in mind that a couple of groups, a group of journalists and a group of elders have been to court already and have had an order from, or a decision from a BC Supreme Court judge essentially saying that the RCMP has been violating the rights of the public and of journalists in its implementation of the order and not following the intent of the the injunction in terms of protecting those.
Yes. When that decision came down, we followed that story a little bit. One of the things that seemed clear from that was the judge ordered the RCMP to amend the order, but there was some question over how that would be enforced, since it was only the RCMP who would be able to do that. Are you aware that we've seen any change since that order has come down?
I don't think that the order amended the terms of the injunction related to the
Yes.
journalists, and then made some general comments on how the order should be interpreted in relation to the general public. My view is that if the RCMP are actually preventing the members of the public who are there for legitimate reasons from accessing those lands in ways that are unreasonable, that are not balanced, they are arguably committing contempt. They're violating the court order itself. So there would be potential enforcement action for them. Obviously, there have been complaints made to the body that oversees the RCMP as well. But I think that the questions of the RCMP's role in this will certainly be raised. The question of Teal Jones's role in excluding the public, I think, should also be raised in this injunction extension. But certainly it seems that the RCMP has been taking the more active role there.
Yeah, and so another one of the court cases that's going on this week is the RCMP are actually looking to have their powers under the injunction extended, as I understand it, so that they would be able to search people trying to enter the grounds and possibly deny them entry. So I'm wondering what your perspective on that.
So frankly,
is.
I'm not familiar with the motion that's being brought. I'd be interested in seeing the pleadings. I think that would be quite disturbing. I mean, there's lots of case law saying that these are lands and roads that are available for the public to use. The logging companies do not have an exclusive right to use these lands. It is a shared area. They have an exclusive right to log there, but that doesn't mean that they can be preventing members of the public from going to these areas for whatever reasons, as long as they are not actually blocking logging operations. They can be going there to protest, but they have to do it in a way that will not interfere with logging. So the idea that the RCMP already has been intimidating, their practices have already intimidated a lot of people who otherwise would be going to those areas. The Port Renfrew Chamber of Commerce has complained that tourism's way down because people are just avoiding the region for fear that they'll be caught up in by the RCMP in this injunction. So I think it would be very disturbing, and I wouldn't expect that the courts would side with broadening police powers when there's some evidence that they've already been abusing and going beyond the powers they have.
And earlier on in our conversation, you touched on basically what an injunction is, and I want to return to that. So as I understand it now, an injunction is typically something granted so that until something sees the court, situation can sort of be maintained, or there can be some
that's
sort
right.
of peace.
So that's an interim injunction. That's this type of injunction. It's an interim injunction. You can also, after a trial, get a permanent injunction, but that's not what this is.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that none of the parties really wants this interim, or wants this to see trial.
So
can you explain why that is?
We got to be clear here. It's not that they don't want a hearing on whether or not the injunction should be extended. In order to get the injunction, Teal Jones had to sue, saying that they were suffering economic harm from the blockades. And what no parties, at least I can't speak for Teal Jones, but certainly in general, logging companies haven't wanted to see individual protesters have to pay up money that they probably don't have anyhow, and after the expense of a long and protracted and public court case. It makes them look like bullies. They don't probably recover the money that they've lost given the huge quantities involved. And certainly, in other logging protests, there have actually been cases where logging CEOs have said publicly, we're only doing this to get the injunction. We are not trying to, sue anybody. But legally, they are. They're trying to sue anybody. So there's this difference between what the sort of theoretical basis of what the law requires, which would require them to be moving towards a trial, and what the logging companies want, which is just the temporary injunction so they can get their logging done and the matter is settled. The matter is resolved because the logging has been done. It's in many ways, I think, shows that injunctions are probably not the best tool to be used for this, but it's the only tool that the logging companies have, and the province has explicitly said that they will not generally use criminal law powers, and they certainly haven't stepped in and provided any other tools through legislation. So it's a gap that the courts are filling because the province hasn't provided alternative tools.
I see. And so I guess this kind of conflict inherent to what this type of injunction is supposed to be for and what it is being used for is kind of what could be one of the key deciding factors?
I don't think so. I mean, the courts have been very clear that they accept, although they're not necessarily pleased about it, that they accept that this type of injunction will often be necessary. I do think it's an important point of difference of understanding between the protesters and the courts, where the protesters, the courts actually view, the view that the judges generally take of injunctions is that once you've issued an injunction, everyone should follow it. It doesn't matter if they feel that they have moral reasons beyond that, and that if you don't follow it, that actually directly challenges the rule of law, the idea that we all should be subject to rules. Whereas the protesters don't, for the most part, I think, appreciate a distinction between this and any other law. The reason that the logging companies can get this injunction is because BC forestry law gives them the rights to log, and that's precisely what they're protesting. The injunction simply the logical extension of the law that they want to protest. So there's a big disconnect between the view that the judges have of these orders and the completely different understanding on the part of the protesters for the most part.
And it falls to the RCMP to enforce that difference, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, the RCMP clearly has a role to enforce the injunction. I mean, what's quite interesting here is that the RCMP needs to take good faith measures to actually stop anyone from interfering with the logging. And I mean, certainly in the 90s, we saw, the RCMP would come out if people blocked the road preventing a logging truck from getting through. They would read the injunction. If they still refused to move, they would arrest people. So it was very targeted to, is this person actually interfering with the logging operations? The whole exclusion zones and like breaking up camps and all this seems to go well beyond the order, the sort of what's strictly required by the injunction and the enforcement terms of the injunction. And so the question of why is the RCMP making a decision to enforce in this way, I think is an important one. And why are they making it? Who's making the decision about just how much money they're spending on this? Because it's colossal sums to support some very aggressive enforcement. That's not. In my view, that's not required by the enforcement order. That's a discretionary. The RCMP is given discretion in how they enforce. They do have to enforce, but they're given discretion in how they enforce, and they're taking a very expensive and hardline approach to that.
So those questions you're raising about who is dictating their approach, how can the public get answers to those?
Yeah, I think ultimately there'll probably be some freedom of information requests on this, and journalists like yourselves researching it. It's certainly. There was a call by some MPs during the federal election campaign for a federal inquiry into the conduct of the RCMP in terms of some of the more violent and adversarial approaches. Those may go somewhere. It ultimately does. I think to a certain degree it does relate to the question I raised earlier, which is that. Are the rights of third parties and parties who are not technically breaking the injunction getting caught up in the enforcement of this injunction? Because the more confrontational, the less tied to arresting particular people who are actually blockading at the time the police's actions are, the more likely they're going to actually violate the rights. The police will be violating the rights of members of the public to protest or to access the area. And that is something the courts, I hope, will be considering.
Andrew Gage of West Coast Environmental Law, speaking to me in advance of several BC Supreme Court hearings scheduled for this week in Nanaimo. You're listening to Mid-Coast Morning with CHLY. 2 weeks ago on the program, we spoke with 4 of the 5 candidates for the Nanaimo Ladysmith riding in the federal election. We now bring you a conversation with the 5th and final candidate, Stephen Welton, who is representing the People's Party of Canada. This is Welton's first time running in the riding, and it is the second election for the People's Party in general. In 2019, they won just under 1.5% of the local vote. I'm wondering, how has the campaign been going so far?
The campaign's been going brilliantly. We've had some hurdles in getting recognized by mainstream media. As you would well know, the Maxime Bernier has been excluded from the national stage, the debate. And we've been otherized, I kind of borrowing that term or stealing that term, that we get referred to as other instead of being recognized as a legitimate, significant party. But when we're out there doing our campaigning, we're getting a tremendous amount of support.
And can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what drew you to the People's Party?
So I've not been particularly political in the past. I've usually voted, but I can't actually say always. And my vote has moved around from party to party, depending on the situation of the day and the platforms they were putting forward. And if I ever voted for a particular party and they didn't get in power, I would just simply say, okay, that was democracy. My choice wasn't the majority choice. And I was always able to live with that. Now, I found myself in a situation now being semi-retired. I used to be an environmental engineer, a project manager specializing in environmental programs, health and safety. And I retired from that, or semi-retired from that, 5-6 years back, and started my own little consulting business. I was doing some contracting work on people's homes in the Nanaimo area. And as I've kind of watched the political stage unfold and watched the world turn in a rather, what strikes me as radical shift of direction and an acceleration of that, it got me concerned at first. And I started to notice the People's Party of Canada platform develop and paid attention to Maxime Bernier. And that aligned with my general beliefs. But certainly in this past year and this year and a half of COVID and the increasing restrictions, that feel of losing rights and freedoms, I felt compelled to step up. That, in effect, when I think many of us do this thing where we're thinking, okay, what are the things I'm going to be thinking on my deathbed? Am I going to be proud of what I did? And one thing I realized was that if I did not step up at this time, having these concerns, I would not be too pleased with myself.
Let's talk about what some of those concerns are and what some of the People's Party platform goals are. They're certainly a lot different than a lot of the other major parties. Some of the planks in your platform include ending official multiculturalism, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, and ending programs that allow immigrants to bring their parents into Canada. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the rationale behind these platform goals?
Sure. Sometimes the language is a little bit off-putting. It startles. And I want to assure that I don't think there's anything radical in this. What we're looking for is to respect the Canadian identity. We believe there is a Canadian identity and culture. And we want to preserve that by having immigration numbers at levels where we believe, where sociological studies show that people can be properly integrated into our society, not be feeling like sometimes people can be siloed. They can be ghettoized if they're coming in too quickly, all go into one area and don't get adequate exposure to the Canadian experience. So that's not about, so those limits on the number of people really are for a healthy absorption into our population. We also feel that reflects on our economic situation. Basic supply-demand in economic theory, you bring people in too fast, there's just too much of a demand for housing, and the supply can't keep up, which drives prices higher. So one of the ways we'll protect Canadians who have legitimate concerns about increasing cost of living, ridiculous cost of housing, or what for many they look at as a ridiculous cost of housing, we'll be able to help contain that by not letting the demand outstrip the supply.
And you talked about a Canadian identity in that last answer. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that is?
I think on the world stage, Canadians have always been seen to be a very sort of accepting group. They have a lot of different looks to them, but we're the friendly and polite people. We try not to ruffle too many feathers on the world stage. We just want to be the people who enjoy our families and that go out and enjoy the beautiful country that we have.
Aren't those values that you mentioned there kind of traditionally associated with being a tolerant and welcoming place for large numbers of immigrants?
I don't think you have to attach some kind of a number to how many immigrants and whether that defines your level of tolerance. I would suggest, I certainly feel that when we get into this numbers game, you should. On the ends of the spectrum, there would be zero immigration, and on the other end, unlimited immigration. So we have to figure out. I don't think there's too many people that want zero or completely unlimited, and that chaotic, out of control situation. So the policy is simply putting together the societal studies and what we want the country to be, and establishing what is a reasonable number. So really the argument becomes not are you on one side of the debate or the other, but just what do you think is the appropriate number? Our number happens to be lower than some of the other parties.
I'm wondering if we can turn now to the local race, and you can give me a little bit of a perspective on how that's shaping up with the other candidates here in Nanaimo, and what you think are some of the biggest issues specifically to this riding.
Well, in truth, as I reflect on it and I look around and I listen to people, their concerns in this particular race are not about what's in it for Nanaimo Ladysmith, but what's in it for us as Canadians. But it is a shared concern. And that's probably appropriate that we are talking about a federal election and the national stage. And people here are very, very concerned about the loss of rights and freedoms, the fear of mandatory vaccination, or at least coerced vaccination through vaccine passports and restrictions for those that don't have one.
With more than 85% of British Columbians receiving a dose at least of vaccine already, do you feel that there's really that strong of a majority sentiment against vaccines?
Oh, I'm not saying that it's a majority sentiment against having the vaccine. What I'm talking about is the rights and freedoms where the individual gets to choose whether they are vaccinated or not. And moving away from what I think is a horrible sentiment being conveyed and a horrible dichotomy that there are those who are vaccinated and those who are not, and the people who are not are the evil ones. I think that's horrid.
And what about some other issues in the local race? Some people are talking about the cost of housing. The environment seems to be a large issue a lot of other candidates are talking about. What are your stances on those?
Well, when it comes to the cost of housing, it is increasing here. There's no doubt about that. And sometimes it's gone in what feels like leaps and bounds. Now, there are pros and cons to that. The people who got into the market are very pleased with the increase in their equity in their homes. Over recent decades, home ownership has become one of the boons to our economics. As people feel the wealth being generated in their home, and that frees them up to spend money to improve their homes and improve their lives. That does present the problem for those that are renting and wanting to get into the market. And we would want to help with that by reducing some of the causes of inflation. As I mentioned, one of the causes of inflation is the greater demand for housing that is created when immigration levels are too high. Some of the others are bureaucratic red tape, and I can't solve all those at a federal level, but I would like to think we can have conversations and have some influence that reduce things like land transfer taxes and all the costs that there are now in the system just to put a piece of land on the market ready to build a home on it. When it comes to the environmental side, as I say, I worked as an environmental engineer. I have 2 undergraduate degrees in earth sciences. I'm very, very aware of climate change. I understand, I worked my entire career on trying to reduce our impact. Industrial impact in particular was my specialty. I was cleaning up contaminated sites. I was installing pollution control equipment in industrial plants. So I was on the ground doing real environmental work. It is a passion of mine. I'm a big believer that we should protect our ancient forests. For the people of Nanaimo, we just have to make sure that the choices made to be a global player in this are not punishing the average citizen with higher home heating costs and the costs of the gas pump, because most of us are still driving those gasoline burning vehicles. And we've seen those prices rise, not just at the cost of oil, but very much the taxes that are imposed upon that. So every time somebody is filling up at the pump just because they want to get to work and back and take their kids to school, et cetera, they're being punished for that. And I don't believe that punishing the average person in Nanaimo Ladysmith, while much of the rest of the world continues to emit carbon at rates that are our rates of carbon emission pale in comparison. I don't think that's very effective. I don't think it's fair to, as I say, to punish us for that.
So what would be the People's Party's plan to mitigate the climate change crisis?
So there's an inference in your question about a climate change crisis. And we are unconvinced that it is this crisis. We are rejecting the idea of climate alarmism. We are all in favor of supporting improvements in our technologies moving forward to reduce our impacts. As I say, that's what my career was very much about, was reducing impact on the environment. But this idea that we all have to fear for our lives, that we won't be able to exist in whatever number of years you put on that, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, we reject that. It's causing us to make bad decisions.
Well, I don't know if I would necessarily say the science suggests we aren't going to exist, but this year the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change came out with a report that suggested within the next 20 years, the global temperature was going to go up 2 degrees if we didn't do anything to mitigate it, and even if we do anything to mitigate it. And we're already experiencing events such as the unprecedented heat wave earlier this summer, which saw the record-breaking temperature in Canada, in Lytton, which burned down the week after. Is that really alarmism?
So I think you're conflating weather and climate. And I think we have to be paying attention indeed when we break records like this and try to understand what is going on. But this is not necessarily, and trends do not always continue. And climate change has happened since the world was created. That's a norm. Now, those cycles, sometimes you're on an increase cycle and sometimes you're on a decrease. And at any point in that cycle, if it's on the way up, if you only projected that line, it would go up forever. Or if it was coming down, if you only projected that line, it would go down forever. But it has been a cycle, and we need to understand where we are on that cycle. And I'll further that comment to say that back in the 70s and 80s, there were all kinds of newspaper headlines that we were heading into an ice age. So I would put the question back to you, are we brilliant now and we're stupid then? Or do we just have scientific theories at any given point that need to be explored and constantly evaluated? And in terms of our practice, are we going to do so much harm to the lives of Canadians while just on the basis of this theory that instills fear in people?
We're running out of time. There's so much more to discuss. I would thoroughly enjoy discussing more, but I think we have to leave it there. Stephen Welton, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with me.
Thanks. I really appreciate this opportunity. It was a great conversation.
Stephen Welton, representing the People's Party of Canada in the upcoming federal election. You're listening to Mid-Coast Morning with CHLY. Still with the election, Nanaimo Ladysmith is one of many ridings across Canada that is seeing a shortage of poll workers. Andrea Marantz from Elections Canada explained the issue to me earlier this week.
Recruiting election workers is always a challenge. Elections come along and we need to recruit up between 230 and 240,000 people across the country to work for a few days. So it is a challenge. It's sort of a challenge by definition. But this year, it seems that the pandemic is adding another layer on top of that, there are people who commonly work for us who are concerned about the safety at the polls. And I just want to reassure people that there will be health and safety measures in place that should keep the poll workers and the electorate safe.
Can you elaborate on what some of those measures are?
Yeah, these have been developed over the course of the pandemic in consultation with the Public Health Agency of Canada and regional health authorities. And the simple things that we all learned right from the beginning, which is, social distancing, wearing masks, those are going to be absolutes at the polls. Masks are required for all poll workers at all times, and there will be hand sanitizing stations at the entrance and the exit of every polling station. There will be physical barriers at the desks between the poll worker and the person coming in to vote that are plexiglass. So there will be no need to physically handle anything from the electorate. So we're very, very conscious of these things, and the social distancing will definitely be maintained. It'll be well marked on the floors of the polling places where people should stand. So we've been reassured that these are the measures that we needed to take. And the other thing to consider is that the time that you're actually in the polling place, I don't mean on the occasions if you're in standing in a line when you're coming at a time that there's a lot of other people, but when you're actually in the polling place where the polling workers are, it's generally 5 minutes to get your vote done and out the other side. So it's very short term.
And I'm wondering if there is a contingency plan for if you don't get the typical number of poll workers.
Yeah, there are still things that we can do. We can combine polls so that rather than having one person poll worker per poll, polls are established by your address, and we try and keep them a small number of people. So we may need to put some of those together. But if we can get enough people, it will definitely help in terms of our ability to get people in and out very quickly.
And how do people become poll workers?
It's really simple. You just go to elections.ca and there's an icon for jobs. Click on that, and it's a very simple procedure to get your application in. You will be assigned to your own district, so you'll be working close to home, and these are all paid positions. There's paid training involved as well, and you'll get time and a half after 8 hours, and everybody will be working more than 8 hours. So.
And I've seen a few articles or people going on the record and saying they even backed out of the training when they found out that poll workers wouldn't need to be vaccinated. Was there ever any consideration given to having like a vaccine mandate for the elections workers this year?
It was considered. It was not something that was decided. That it was decided that we would not have a vaccine mandate. That said, we know that the majority of poll workers will be vaccinated. That's the demographic of the people that come to work for us. We have Elections Canada encourages people to be vaccinated, and we're hoping that will be the case.
And is there anything else you think people need to know about the staffing shortage facing the riding, or just the election in general?
I think that people need to know that it's a really good civic experience, citizens' experience to come and work at an election. And the fact that elections are put on very locally. These are your neighbors who will be working at the polls. If you're working at the polls, you're seeing your neighbors who are coming through. It's put on extremely locally, and it's a very important thing to do, and an important thing to maintain.
Andrea Marantz from Elections Canada on a poll worker shortage affecting Nanaimo Ladysmith and other ridings. You're listening to Mid-Coast Morning on CHLY. When avid diver Kathleen Reed went under the waters off the coast of Nanoose Bay recently, they stumbled on what had become a mass grave for a vital form of marine life here on the coast. I spoke with Reed about that discovery earlier this week. Can you tell me about what you saw that day?
Sure. So we dropped down underwater and were really surprised to see pretty much every single sea cucumber, just white or in various stages of decomposition. They are normally dark red, purple when they're healthy, and in this case, there were white lesions on some, and then as the disease progresses, it just has them disintegrating into a white pile of flesh.
And how many sea cucumbers would you say you saw that day like this?
Hundreds. Yeah, there was about one every square meter.
And you mentioned a disease. Do you know what this disease is called? Is this something that's common among sea cucumbers?
The scientists just took samples this weekend, but the initial thought about it from the experts is that it's a wasting disease. They're not sure if it's the same one that's wiped out sea stars or not, but it's definitely clearly some sort of wasting issue.
Is this incredibly unusual? Have you ever seen anything like this before?
The disease itself isn't unusual. Researchers have seen it up in Alaska and Comox and Seashelt a little bit this summer, but I've never seen it in Nanoose at all, no. I've been diving for 10 years and I've never seen it like this before.
So what was your reaction to seeing this?
Oh, horrified. I was just absolutely just deeply troubled because they're really the vacuum cleaners of the sea. They kind of crawl along and eat all the stuff that falls down. And if we lose them, we're in trouble.
And can you tell me a little bit more about sea cucumbers? You just mentioned they're the vacuum of the sea. To anyone who's unfamiliar with sea cucumbers, what do they look like? What are they?
Sure. So they are pretty much the size of the length of a loaf of bread, but they're not as wide. They're maybe an inch or two around, and up to 10 inches a foot long. They tend to be dark purple or red, and they have spikes all over their body, just very soft spikes. And they crawl along the seafloor, and they clean up all of the organic detritus that falls along the floor. So they're pretty much like garbage trucks.
And was there anything else other than the sea cucumbers that seemed off that day?
There were a couple of sea stars that were exhibiting signs of wasting disease, and I did just dive again, so a week and a half, 2 weeks later, just yesterday, and the sea cucumbers were definitely still being affected, but so many had died off, and their remains are just washed away that there's just not as many around, but the disease is still there. But the ones under about 20 meters in depth seem to be fine, and that is where the colder water is found. So the scientists are thinking that it is related to climate change and the temperature of the water as well that triggers the disease.
Was there anything unusual about the temperature of the water above that depth?
Yeah, it's been much hotter this summer in the water than last summer. I was checking my dive computer, and it's actually 2 Celsius warmer this year at the same time than it was last year. And so that's a huge difference. It was 18 Celsius in the upper part of the water.
Anything else you think people should know about what you saw that day, or even just diving off the coast of Nanaimo or Nanoose?
Just that we have some of the best cold water diving in the world. It's consistently rated some of the top diving for cold water, and people just kind of look at the surface of the ocean and they don't realize the amazing world that's down there. So yeah, just that this is an incredible place to dive.
Kathleen Reed speaking about large numbers of dead sea cucumbers found off the coast of Nanoose Bay. I was also able to get in touch with Dr. Isabelle Côté, professor of marine ecology at Simon Fraser University, who followed up on Reed's discovery earlier this week. There were reports of sea cucumbers dying en masse off the coast of Nanoose Bay recently, and I understand you've gone and taken a look at the situation.
I did, yesterday, in fact. And, wow, it was really depressing. We dove in. This place, I believe, is called Dolphin Beach. And as soon as we got in and it got to rocks, which is about sort of 5 or 6 meters deep and going all the way down to below 20 meters, virtually every sea cucumber was either diseased or already dead. And the diseased sea cucumbers had various areas of their bodies covered in this white sort of filamentous goo, which just seems to be eating through the tissues. And it was quite incredible. And some of the cucumbers that looked healthy, the very small proportion that looked healthy, healthy meaning they did not have these sort of white lesions on them, did not look quite right. So their parts of their body were narrower than normal, sort of more wrinkled. The spines were retracted. So I think we were seeing sea cucumbers in various stages of the progression of this disease.
Are you aware of what the disease might be?
Not yet. So we've some diseased individuals that we're sending to a scientist in the States, and this is the person who identified the pathogen that was involved in the mortality of the large sea stars in 2013, 2014. And I believe Kathleen and her diving buddy, Jillian Campbell, also collected diseased individuals, the day before that to send to scientists at DFO.
So you mentioned the sea stars from a few years back. It seems like every so often there have been some incidents with diseases affecting sea cucumbers or sea stars around this area. Does this feel similar to that, to those incidents from the past?
It's hard, without identifying the pathogen. In terms of these any-skinned animals, which include birds and urchins, they are relatively prone to mass mortality events. So these kinds of things have been happening over the years. But in comparison to the mass mortality of sea stars that we had a few years ago, that happened in a very, very warm year. I suppose this year's a warm year as well. But it also happened when the sea stars were at extremely high density. So you had a pathogen that was very contagious, it seems, and maybe the immune system was possibly stressed by the warm conditions. For these sea cucumbers, they're not, the site that I visited yesterday and the sites that Kathleen and Gillian visited prior to that, they're not sites where literally the sea cucumbers are piled on top of one another because they're so abundant. So density probably doesn't play much of a factor here. We did have an extremely warm summer, including, the dome event, and the sea cucumbers that we saw. Most of the diseased and dead ones were above or shallower than about 24 meters, and below that there's a much lower proportion that are sick. So it could be that temperature had an effect on things, but I think it's too early to tell. So with Kathleen and Gillian and Lim, who's a master's student in my lab, we're currently trying to assemble all these observations that recreational divers are making basically every time they go out diving. We're trying to pull all of this together to see the geographic extent of this mortality event and the extent in terms of proportion of sea cucumbers that are affected in various parts right now of the Strait of Georgia, but anywhere where divers are.
Yeah, and I just spoke to earlier this morning the president of the Pacific Sea Cucumber Harvesting Association.
Mm-hmm.
He mentioned that they don't actually harvest around Nanaimo or Nanoose Bay, but up and down the coast of the island and other places, they haven't seen anything like this so far. Do you think that this could just be an isolated incident, or is this something that has the potential to become much more widespread? I know it might be too early to say.
Yeah, it is pretty early, and we'll get certainly a clearer picture once these observations by recreational divers start rolling in. But there seems to be a report from Brentwood Bay, and there seems to be a report from the mainland around Howe Sound as well. So, we'll have to see whether those two reports are of the same thing that we're seeing near Nanoose Bay. Hopefully it's a localized phenomenon that we're not going to start seeing, up and down the coast, because sea cucumbers obviously are important for fisheries, but they're also very important ecologically. What
are some of the roles they play ecologically?
Yeah, they pee. So they pee and they sweat, just like anybody else. And their pee and sweat is full of nitrogen, which acts as a fertilizer for all the plants, basically the seaweeds and so on. So because they're large, they're relatively abundant, and they have lots of soft tissue, they excrete this nitrogen at quite high concentrations. So they're very important, essentially, as a provisioning, as a provider of nitrogen as fertilizer. They're also basically like little vacuum cleaners. So they eat and they process sediment on rock and on sand, and they essentially keep it clean. They eat and remove all the organic matter and poop out essentially clean sediment. So these are potentially odd-sounding roles, but in the whole sort of ecology of rocky reef, these are really, really important functions.
So even with the localized incident here, if it is that, with the hundreds of them that have died off, what's the impact of them missing going to be?
Well, it's going to be interesting. It's probably at the end of the day going to be difficult to measure, because as far as I know, other than sort of the site-specific knowledge of people who dive there very often, like Kathleen and Gillian, there's no baseline. There's no pre-mortality information of what the system looked like what the abundance of sea cucumbers were, what the, kelp and so on. So we don't have pre-mortality data. So that's going to make measuring the impact really difficult. So we could go out there and we could start seeing how the system is changing from this point onward. But having that baseline is really, really important to be able to accurately measure what the impact is.
Is that lack of baseline data something that might apply more generally to marine wildlife around the province and the coast?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, we have some baseline data from places, for example, near field stations like Bamfield and Hackeye. But for most areas, we don't have. We have sort of very coarse baselines, but we have very fine scale data that allows us to detect, subtle changes. I mean, it could be that the effects of losing sea cucumbers are not going to be subtle, but sometimes you have very subtle changes that end up having sort of bigger repercussions down the line. And if you can't see those changes or measure these small changes right at the start, then you end up being surprised, some years down the road by something that you should have been able to predict if you'd had a baseline, but you didn't have a baseline.
And how can we get a baseline just as a society?
Yeah, it's, this is a huge question you're asking here. The kind of work that generates baseline is monitoring. It's regular monitoring. And monitoring is just so low on the list of priorities until something big happens. So, for example, when the sea star mortality happened in 2013, 2014, all of a sudden there was a big rush to go count sea stars. But in many places it was already too late because, the majority of sea stars had died. So if we valued monitoring more, we could devote, as a society, as a government, we could devote a bit more funds towards that relatively dull scientific activity, which is, however, so important when a massive event happens. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that we have to monitor every square centimeter of our coast, but having, that there are very, very big gaps between the places that we have good monitoring data for.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm sure it's a situation that applies to things well beyond the scope of sea cucumbers on the ocean.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So we're just running out of time here. Before I let you go, is there anything else you think the public needs to know about this mass die-off or anything else about marine life in general?
I think, if people, a lot of people are interested in the ocean, even people who don't dive might regularly take walks, by the beach and so on. I think any time that you see something unusual, report it. Send an email to the biology department of a university near yourself, call somebody in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, but report these unusual events that you notice, and that could well trigger studies and realizations that the unusual event in your area is actually just the beginning of a much more widespread event. And I'm talking about mortality in particular, but it could be anything strange, like strange animals that are washed up on the beach that you've never seen, which could, the introduction of an invasive species, or a warming event that's brought southern species further north, or whatever. I think the public certainly should never be shy about reporting unusual sightings or unusual events.
Dr. Côté, thank you very much for taking some of your time to speak with me on this.
It's my pleasure. Anytime.
Dr. Isabelle Côté, Professor of Marine Ecology at Simon Fraser University, on the discovery of hundreds of dead sea cucumbers around the coast of Nanaimo. That's our show for today. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. On behalf of everyone here at CHLY, thanks so much for listening.